Nor. What's the difference between a minor virtual distinction and the formal distinction between Aquinas and Scotus? And is there any benefit in employing both? Okay, so I guess I'll start out as I always do from the ground level, sort of working up to being able to speak about this because oftentimes what happens is we'll kind of just throw out all these terms, and the SCOTUS will say formal distinction, the Thomas will say minor virtual distinction, and you get Durandus just comes out of the woods and says modal distinction, and we kind of just throw all of these terms out at one another, but nobody actually knows what they're talking about. So what's really important is first by distinction, all we mean by distinction is some sort of remotion. So that is some sort of lack of identity. So distinction means lack of identity. So with this lack of identity, it can either be something which is in entity. I know identity and entity, or lack of identity and entity, or lack of identity in ratio. So something which is in the intellect. And this is described as either a lack of identity before reasoning or after reasoning. So if it's a lack of identity before reasoning, it's something that either could be separable or inseparable. If it's separable, then it's some call it like a major real distinction. If it's inseparable, some call it a modal real distinction. And I guess I'll use that terminology. Okay, so that's a real distinction right there. It's a lack of identity and entity. Say that 5 times quickly. Lack of identity and entity. And it's also we could also actually refer to that as like a lack of material identity, if you want to put it like that. That's a good way of speaking. So, on the other hand, we can have it this distinction in the consideration of the intellect. So, the distinction is not antecedent to the intellect. So, for example, God knowing Himself, God doesn't in Himself know a distinction between His justice and mercy. That's something that's in our intellects, and I'll explain sort of distinction here now, because in the consideration of the intellect, this lack of identity or remotion, it can either be something with a foundation in the thing or without a foundation in the thing. If it has a foundation in the thing, a fundamentum in re, that is something which is known as a virtual distinction, and I'll get into that in a little bit. If it's something which is of the reasoning, so if it's something which is basically without a foundation in the thing, we kind of just like the distinction between, if I said Hassan is Hassan, the distinction between the Hassan as subject and Hassan as object in this sentence is one that is a distinction of reasoning. So it's something without a foundation in the thing, a virtual distinction without foundation in the thing. Now, that virtual distinction. So why is it called a virtual distinction? Well, it's called a virtual distinction because the thing has some sort of virtuality. It has some sort of power or ability to ground a distinction in our intellect. So it's not before the intellect, but it gives some grounds where, like, if it comes into contact with an intellect, at least with our intellect, it's going to form a distinction in our intellect. So there's a twofold foundation for this. So it's a foundation in the object. So the perfection of the object is above the powers of our intellect, and it's also a foundation in our intellects as well in a certain way, because our intellects are too small to be able to know it under one concept. So this is a virtual distinction. Now, the virtual distinction itself can be distinguished between 2 types of virtual distinction: a minor virtual distinction and a major virtual distinction. So the major virtual distinction is with the 2 members of the distinction. The distinctions are related as perfecting and perfected. So, for example, when we think of the distinction between rational and animal and man, rationality perfects the concept of animality, but they're not really distinct, and it's not a distinction of reasoning. On the other hand, they can be, that's said to be perfectly prescinded. That's the language of it. On the other hand, we can have a minor virtual distinction. So the minor virtual distinction is a distinction where the 2 members are related as explicit and implicit. So, for example, when we think of the justice and the mercy of God, the mercy of God is implicitly contained in the justice of God, but they're distinct rationes, they're distinct concept ideas, so to speak. They have distinct foundations in God. So when we think of, Okay, so with the formal distinction, so the formal distinction, some are going to say that this is basically the same as the minor virtual distinction. Some are going to say that they're different things because the Thomists actually do use the language of formal distinction, distinct formalities, which we take as distinct rationes, so distinct sort of fundamental concepts in a certain thing that has some relation to our intellect. So we do use a language of formally distinct, which is opposed to materially distinct, which is distinction in entity. So that real distinction right